last time we kind of got into a little bit of imaginal with like transmutation, but the ideas around consciousness specifically we want to get back to were beingness. So being conscious versus not, and the idea of beingness, the idea of self, so true self versus actual self, and then with consciousness that you are a good thing and you come to know that directly. This shaky sense of self or of feeling bad or not worthy, that it's kind of it's an illusion, and that consciousness can help show the truth that consciousness is already enough.
Because we kind of did imaginal work, right?
Yeah, I think conscious mirroring is what got us into it, just because with mirroring, there are these unconscious aspects of ourselves that I think operate on the imaginal level. So the note I have is like, we're stuck in darkness, experience that we are these ancient spirits or archetypes, and that we don't want to be them, and there's a terrible shame at being them. So I think it's because consciousness frees us from these, or frees us from the feeling that we have to escape these parts of ourselves, right?
It basically comes down to that, right? The distinction, the discernment between self and not self, or what one is versus an experience. So ontology versus phenomenology. If you just think of the ego mind, and I'm defining that or describing that as this organ, this mechanism, this energy center that registers data via the physical body, via the energy body, information gets organized, processed, interpreted, and this experience registers in this ego-aware way for us, right? So we, like if you try to say what's the difference between a robot and an animal and a human, it's like, well, we think of the robot as not having sentience, not having beingness. The robot's this mechanism. The animal, some would say, has a soul. Obviously different people have different views about the idea of a soul, but if we say the animal has a beingness, or is an entity, or is the idea of a sentient being, but then humans have this awareness or this consciousness or this experience that seems to be beyond what the animal kingdom has. And as far as, well, what is that thing? Beyond just robots or animals, humans seem to have ego awareness, and then there's also consciousness. And if we say ego awareness occurs via a certain mechanism, right? So if we say that we're really animals plus this ego mechanism, in addition to that, there's consciousness, right? But so if we just leave consciousness out of it for a minute, if you say the humans are animals plus this ego mechanism, the ego mechanism, again, takes in all this sensory data, organizes it, interprets it, and not only decides how to react to situations, which is what we'd say animals do, right? Animals are reacting instinctually, whereas humans are not only reacting instinctually, we seem to have this ability in our brains, in our minds, to transcend instinctual reaction and, tame ourselves, right? Domesticate ourselves. But so if you say that there's this mechanism in the mind that allows us to transcend simply instinctual reaction and allows us to tame ourselves, to domesticate ourselves, to, as Freud would put it, civilize ourselves. That process, it's counter to, in a lot of ways, what the instinctual response would be, right? So if you take those kinds of concepts and you put them in the realm of consciousness work, how does consciousness work relate to all that? One of the important ideas there is that the mechanism of the ego mind is not an actual ontological entity. It's a mechanism. It's a mechanism that creates an idea. It creates a narrative. It creates an energetic structure that then operates as a self. It operates as an identity. The big spiritual insight is it's not an actual entity, though. It's a phenomenon. It's a structure. To use religious language, it's an idol. It's an idol. It's not an actual being. And, as I'm saying all the time, in modern culture, our biggest idol, each individual's idol these days, is their own mind. Their own ego mind mechanism is made into a structure, objectified in their awareness, and then oriented to as though it were the center of the universe, as though it were teller of truth, which obviously has bad repercussions.
Right. I mean, I think that's worth saying again, just just restating that idea that our ego is our biggest idol. That's, I know you've said it before, but I feel like I kind of hear a different thing each time you say it. Like you said, that to have that be the center of your universe and to orient from the idea that this construction is truth is a huge trap.
And we don't know we're doing it. It's part of the trickiness of the trap. One of the books I have on my website as far as a referral, there's a book called The Mind Object. And, the general idea is this happens to us in adolescence. So the arrogance, the narcissism, the ideology of the adolescent, there's a natural developmental phase for it, There seems to be a natural developmental phase. It's that whole idea of is this ego identification thing a big, terrible, mistake? Is it the fall of mankind? Is there some way to actually avoid it, or is it a necessary step in the progression of the development of consciousness? It certainly seems to happen. Maybe there is some way to avoid it, but if we just kind of take it as it is, it's like, okay, this seems to happen. And a lot of theorists, and I think Ken Wilber and Washburn and a bunch of those guys are in general agreement that it's kind of necessary to develop the individual ego self, and then you go beyond that, ideally, and in going beyond it, deconstruction of that basically false self that was constructed to get you from point A to point B. And the deconstruction of that is obviously a complicated thing.
I feel like if you begin to do the work of deconstructing it, one of the questions that comes up is like, well, why was this ever here?
Right.
Why? And I totally agree that people who've spent a lot of time talking about it or thinking about it are in a general consensus that it is necessary, that we have to go through that process of building something up, because if there's no structure there to begin with, that's a whole other set of problems.
Yeah.
So if you don't put something in place to function, then you'll fall apart. And it's also the deconstructing. There has to be something to compare to in the process of that deconstruction. That this work to undo these robotic processes, these ego structures and compensations, undoing that work as you, maybe this is a transition to talking about true self or actual self, as you begin to move towards that, there's something to compare it to see what the progress is or what the work is actually doing. I had this experience the other day of just looking at these photos of myself from years ago and the things that I was doing and thinking about the things that I was thinking. And it felt like it was another person in a way. I feel like that's an example of what I'm trying to express about the necessary construction and deconstruction of our identity. That we do and say things while we're, to borrow someone else's term, asleep. And when we wake up, it seems like somebody else did them.
Yeah. Just a note on you said if you don't have the structure, then we fall apart. And an important part of that is that one of the functions the structure serves is to a certain degree, prevent you from simply being overrun by the imaginal spirits. The ego mind structure is like a boat on the ocean that keeps you, to a certain degree, free of all of those creatures in the ocean, because all those creatures are ready to possess you. And so, to the extent that we do open up that structure, these different imaginal level archetypes, energies, spirits, entities, whatever you want to call them, then come up and have more possession over us. So it's that interplay of how robotic and mechanistic and sort of lifeless, but very stable and rational and logical are you, versus how deep, possessed, magical, artistic, creative are you, right? There's kind of that juxtaposition. The ability to move and motivate and express the imaginal realm is what's most moving to us. We're all subject to this, where if we say that the imaginal realm is qualitatively different than this idea of the ego structure that we call the self. And again, I'm making a distinction between thought and the actual structure that's built that then is called self. The structure that the ego structure that's this mental structure that becomes self requires thought, but it's thoughts are part of the building blocks of this structure, but it's the structure and the identification with the structure that I'm referring to. And so if we're saying that's this mechanistic, lifeless thing versus the imaginal realm, which is this deep, rich, tempting, motivating, moving, terrifying, wonderful realm, in an attempt to get control, to get organized, to get civilized, to make our way up out of that imaginal realm. The ego structure was built. Again, like building a boat frees you up from what it's like to try to swim from here to there. But again, there's a loss of the deep, rich, moving aspect of the imaginal. And so this idea of modern day malaise and meaninglessness and disconnection and depression, is that it's that we're living by this mechanistic thing and we're lacking the realness of the imaginal. And anytime the imaginal does creep through, we go nuts for it. We love it. And so whether it's a piece of music or the way someone's behaving or whatever, it's like when the imaginal creeps through, it is very moving to us. And so there was this period of history where the people that were these conjurers, were thought to be evil because they were dabbling in the imaginal realm. It's not that long ago, and it's still happening. We don't use those terms anymore. But when Elvis Presley was moving his pelvis around, that was incredibly moving and incredibly dangerous. Big part of society thought that was very dangerous to conjure up that kind of sexuality. And it is. I'm not saying that it should be prohibited, but it is. It's very moving. All of this, sort of getting back to, so if there's this ego mind structure that's not an actual ontological entity, but it's rather a construction, and that we lose touch with our actual ontological selves, and our attentional field becomes fixated on this structure in our own head as the self, which therefore leaves one in a experience that is then in fact void of ontological beingness. we experience that. We feel that. It's like the juice is gone. The magic's gone. The goodness, the light is gone. And we feel empty, depressed, disconnected. And it's a terrible, terrible thing. And we all know this, whether we only experience that every once in a while or whether that's, your experience the majority of the time. It's a very real thing. It's not a bad attitude. It's not, that, well, you need to look at life this way instead of that way. It's more real than that. I think there's a real disservice, even in the mental health industry, this idea that, for example, if you just change your belief system, then you won't be depressed or you won't feel disconnected. And I think that's a mistake. I think there's something much more real, much more organic, much more deep going on that needs to be addressed. That's certainly what depth psychotherapy is about. It's what a lot of religious and spiritual work is about. Certainly, the kind of the common viewpoint on religions these days is that it's a big mental mind control, culty kind of thing, and I think a lot of religious activity is that. But at the same time, I think true religions or true religious practice or true religious experience is actually not that. It's quite different from that. It's, in a lot of ways, you could say it's the opposite of that. It's an attempt to get at what's actually real. And it's obviously a very difficult thing to try to navigate which is which.
Well, yeah, you're having to group together a bunch of individual experiences of the same thing that are not related on the surface and are only related once you begin to do that work of deconstruction, to see what brings people together. And forcing that, I think, is the cult-like potential of it. But providing a space for it is the actual potential of it.
I like the way you said that as far as the creating the space for it, because
that's the dimension approach.
Because that's why I like it.
That's fair.
If you could just find a way to throw the word dimension in there, it would. The reason I say that is, again, this thing where creating the space for it is different than, I feel like my job doing the dimension approach, and I keep saying it, I'll say it again, everyone's doing the dimension approach some of the time, and some of the time they're not. When I'm doing the dimension approach, I'm creating a space for someone's experience. Creating a conscious space occurs via the conscious mind. Everyone has a conscious mind, and everyone's creating space with their conscious mind sometimes. And so when we're creating a conscious space experience, then that creates this situation where there can be a movement towards consciousness and via that an ability to discern ontology from phenomenology, an ability to discern and directly experience beingness versus a constructed self, and beingness versus imaginal experience. Because the goal is to be, this whole interplay between imaginal realm possession by archetypes and energies, all this stuff, as well as mechanical, mentally constructed selfhood. The goal with consciousness work is to free yourselves from the entanglement in either of those.
I think that's an important point to distinguish, because it's freeing from the entanglement doesn't mean abandoning. Freeing from the entanglement means becoming aware of the dynamic itself, so that you're not functioning, from, of, as one of those things solely, without any awareness outside of it. Because I think that's a place where people get hung up. Like I say, people, where that I've seen in myself and seen in the way people talk about some of these topics, that there's this idea of transcending the ego. And it's not the whole truth, because those mechanical structures don't go away. Like, it's like you said, it's a developmental stage, so it's not going to be abandoned. It's just going to be deprogrammed and reformed. And the way we relate to it changes, and the way we use it changes. But it's always going to be there to some degree, and to say it's not is just another much more complicated layer of ego.
Each time you say something, most of the time when you say something, at the end of it, I want to say right, or well put, or yes, but then I feel like that just sounds kind of weird for me to say that every time. It's like I'm not sure what I'm supposed to say at the end of it. You know what I mean?
Yeah, totally. Well, yeah, after editing these things, I know exactly what you mean. Like, I'll say something and you go, right. and then you'll talk about something else.
What's a better, like, I guess I don't need to say anything, right?
I think it's funny. I don't know. Yeah, I don't think you have to. You could say right or what. Whatever.
There's sort of this thing where I'm doing more talking than you.
Right.
And
it's your podcast.
Right. But then, so it's like you don't need to affirm what I'm saying.
But I do sometimes.
Yeah, and I like that.
Yeah.
But there's not like a need to. And then
right.
But then for some reason I find myself, it's like, well, if I just leave it silent after you get done talking.
Yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about. I don't think we have to worry about it too much. This whole process has definitely made me less concerned with validation about what I'm saying. That's a topic that's like always on my mind, just in the whole discerning what people are really saying category of listening. And there's this app called Nextdoor where people are always, it's like a neighborhood app, and you can see that neighborhood and what they're saying about stuff. And some woman in our neighborhood was on there talking about how everybody should live in the moment, and there's no anxiety in the moment, and you got to transcend your ego. Your ego is the only thing that's anxious. And all the wise people have ever said is, all the wise people I've ever known have said this, and just on and on. And then at the end, it's like, if you want to know more, visit my Facebook page. And I was like, wow. So this was all in service of your ego and likes on your Facebook page. Thank you for that.
In the same way that I hope this podcast doesn't feel like you just described that. And as far as consciousness versus ego constructed identity and or imaginal realm identity, the idea is that we have the ability to help each other get disentangled, because there's some stuff that you're entangled in that I'm not, and there's some stuff that I'm entangled in that you're not. And so we can help each other. We can also, even if we're both entangled, we can recognize this doesn't feel like consciousness. I think we're both entangled, which is different than me trying to say, I'm fully conscious, and so just look to me and I'll tell you how it is, or I'll disentangle you. I'm only capable of a certain amount of, again, to try to quantify. It's like a certain amount of consciousness. I'm only capable of staying conscious in certain dimensions and not others. I don't have access to all of the dimensions. I don't have the energetic capacity to just sit with anything. I'm just saying I have a certain understanding of the process and am trying to explain my understanding of the process. And yes, in my practice, I have practiced this process all day, every day for a long time now, and I've had a lot of very, very intense experiences, and have seen a lot of different things happen and a lot of different kinds of change happen. And so this is, it took me a long time to understand the process. It took me a long time to try to put words to it. It took a long time to get up the courage to try to talk about it. And so even you and I sitting here having these conversations, and then the idea of putting them up online is a growth edge for me. Once again, I'm speaking to it right now because I fear the backlash of judgment and of various interpretations of what I'm saying or what I'm trying to do.
I hear you on that for sure, and I think blowback is like the word that came to mind talking about it. And I think it's always good just to reiterate what you just said, that all of this is based in personal experience. So the amount of things we can disentangle from is what we're empathetic to. And the amount of things we've seen people entangled in, seen ourselves entangled in, it's an empathetic process that is based in experience. And it's not about fixing. Like you said, it's about providing space for this to happen. And this is all self-work. That there are ways we can help each other and provide space for each other, but the transformation is a self-work process. So it'd be impossible to say that you're going to tell someone how it is for them. You can tell them how it feels to you and what it seems similar to you, but it's a growth process within the person themselves to ever see it and become disentangled from it. There's no going in and fixing it. It's a co-created thing. And that's something we talked about from the beginning, just as we last year, just talking about going about this, that you are extremely well practiced in this approach and this understanding of how to go about healing work in all of these different areas, and that the process is the same. We've been talking about that it doesn't matter what the issue is, that this is that these are necessary steps to healing, regardless of what you call them. And we're talking about how you describe them and how you use them, but this is it's a universal process.
Yeah, I didn't invent anything.
Well, I mean, it's organizing it is important, though. It's like you said, it is your approach to using these tools, and it's your approach to trying to describe it. And I think that's the important effort in all this, is just trying to share it in a way that is hopefully approachable, or at least interesting enough for people to want to learn more. Because people don't talk about it in this way. People don't talk. I mean, there's this idea of an integral approach, and I think it's largely theoretical. Like if you read Ken Wilber, it's a lot of thinking about it. It's not a whole lot about how to do it. And there's other people within his school that are very much about how to practice it or how to incorporate it into different aspects of your work and life. But with any kind of framework, it's how is it lived out on the ground, to me, is what is helpful.
That's awesome, because that's what I'm trying to do.
Because, and again, like I've said this before, but fear of being misunderstood isn't reason enough to not try to say something. And with everything going on right now, the whole idea of worrying about how to say it perfectly, preventing you from saying anything, is a damaging thing too. And it's also like feedback or backlash is not going to change what I mean. It might change what I say.
This shift in general towards long form podcasts and things like that, or at least a movement in that direction where it's not just quick little sound bites. Gives a little more, it creates a space.
That's exactly right. And you get to hear personalities. You get to hear what people think and what they say and what they feel. And you get to hear the space created by the people talking. And that makes an impact on how it's heard and what's understood. If you want to learn more about the Dimension Approach, please visit dimensionapproach.com.